The rain was coming down sideways the night I got back to my tent and found her already inside it. Water sheeted off the brim of my hood and off the shoulders of my jacket, off everything I owned, and I could barely see my own hands in front of me. I unzipped the flap, expecting canvas and quiet, and instead there was a stranger kneeling on my sleeping bag, soaked straight through, one hand held out toward me like she already knew me. A little green enamel kettle steamed on the burner between us, throwing a soft light up across her face. She looked at me, then down at the kettle, then back up at me, and she whispered, "Please, let me stay tonight. Let me back up, because a moment like that doesn't make any sense unless you know the man standing out there in the rain. My name is Nathan Ellis, and I'm 34 years old. I build and repair camping gear out of a narrow workshop in Lake Placid, New York, a town small enough that the same faces walk past my window every morning and nod like we all agreed on something a long time ago. My shop smells like glue and cut leather and the machine oil I use on zippers that have given up on themselves. When it rains, the cables on the drying rack tap against each other, a soft, clicking sound that most people would find annoying and that I've somehow come to sleep to. I live alone in the room above the shop, up a set of stairs that creak in the same 4 places they've always creaked. And if that sounds lonely, I'd have told you for years that it wasn't. I'd have told you it was peace. I was married once. Her name doesn't matter yet. We didn't have any children, and when the marriage ended, it ended clean on paper and messy everywhere else. I kept the shop and the debt that came with it. She kept almost everything about the life she'd wanted the 2 of us to have. For a long time after that, quiet was the only thing I trusted, and the shop gave me plenty of it. People who see me at this contest every year think I show up to win. The Adirondack Camping and Bushcraft Contest is the biggest event in this part of the state. 3 days of shelters and fire and gear pushed hard until it breaks, and folks naturally assume a man who builds equipment shows up to prove his equipment is the best on the mountain. That isn't why I come. I come because these mountains are the only place that never once asked me for an explanation. Up here, nobody wants my side of a story. The trees don't lean in and whisper when I walk past. The river just runs and doesn't ask whose fault anything was. I do test my own gear when I come. That much is honest. I'll pitch a tent I stitched myself and sleep under a tarp I waterproofed by hand. And if something fails at 2 in the morning in a storm, I'd rather learn it up here than sell it to a family who's counting on it to hold. But mostly, I come to be a man in the woods with no history walking a step behind him. For 3 days a year, I get to be just the guy in the green jacket at the far end of the field. And after everything, that is more than enough for me. There's a reason I need those 3 days, and I don't hand it out easily. Years ago, before the shop, before any of this, I led search and rescue in these same mountains. I was the one they called when the weather turned and people didn't come home, and for a while I was good at it, maybe the best they had in this county. Then one river took something from me that I've never once gotten back, and after that, I put the radio down for good. I didn't quit because I stopped caring. I quit because I'd cared about the wrong thing for too long, and in the end it cost more than I ever knew how to pay. That's the part I don't explain, and I'm not going to hand it all to you yet. Not to the people at the contest, not to the woman I used to be married to, not to myself most days. I carry it the way you carry an old injury, favoring it without thinking, building a whole quiet life around never once putting your weight down on it. So when I pitched my tent that first evening, before the storm rolled in over the peaks, I did what I always do. I chose a plot up near the tree line, well away from the crowd and the noise of it. I set my burner in the corner, and I put the kettle on to warm, the same dented green enamel kettle I've carried for 8 years now, and I told myself that this year would be exactly like every other year. 3 quiet days. Nobody asking me a single thing I couldn't answer. I was wrong about that before the first night was even over. The storm came in fast, the way they do up here, the sky going from gray to gone in the space of 20 minutes. I'd gone back out to redrive my stakes because the wind was already lifting the corners of the tent off the ground, and I was out there maybe 10 minutes, hammering cold steel into wet dirt, with the rain running straight down the back of my collar. When I turned around, there was light inside my tent that I hadn't left burning, and a shape moving behind the wall of it, and my whole body went still in a way it used to go still on a call a long time ago, before I taught myself to stop. Then I opened the flap, and there she was. I should have asked her to leave. Any sensible man would have. A stranger in your tent in the dark is a problem, not a person, and every hard rule I ever learned about the backcountry told me to walk her straight down to the marshal's station and let somebody with a clipboard sort it out. But she was shaking, and the rain behind me sounded like the whole sky had come loose at once, and there was something in the way she was looking at me that I couldn't find the words to argue with. So I let the flap fall shut behind me, and I knelt down across from her on the wet floor of my own tent, and I said the only thing that made any sense to say. "You're going to catch your death sitting like that," I told her. "Come closer to the burner. It's warm." She told me her tent had flooded. She'd staked it too low, she said, down in the soft ground near the drainage line, and when the storm hit, the water had come up right through the floor and soaked every single thing she'd brought. Mine was the nearest tent with a light still on. She said all of it fast, the way people talk when they're cold to the bone, and every word of it was true. What I didn't understand yet, what I wouldn't understand for another full day, was that a true reason can sit right down on top of another true reason and hide it completely from view. She wasn't lying to me. She was just choosing to tell me the smaller of the two truths she'd carried into that tent. "I'm Grace," she said, and she wrapped both her hands around the tin cup I gave her like she was half afraid it might get up and leave. I poured the hot water from the kettle and handed the cup across to her, and she held it with both hands and didn't drink from it for a long, long while. She just held it there against her chest, letting the heat soak all the way into her fingers, and she watched the steam rise up off the surface of it the way a person watches something they've been kept away from for a very long time. I remember thinking it was strange, and then I remember deciding it was just the cold, and I let it go. She asked me about the shop, and about the town, and about whether I ever got lonely up above it. And I gave her the easy answers, the ones I hand to everybody. But she listened like the answers mattered, tilting her head a little, and once or twice I caught her looking at me a beat too long, the way you look at a face you're quietly checking against a memory you're not quite sure you trust. We talked, because there wasn't anything else to do while the storm screamed itself hoarse against the canvas. She was a guide, she told me. Worked outdoor trips out of a company a couple hours south of here, took people up peaks who'd never so much as seen a real peak before, and got every one of them back down in one piece. She loved photography most of all. She said she'd started carrying a camera on trips years ago and had never once stopped, that there were whole seasons of her life she now only really remembered through the pictures she'd taken of them. I told her I understood that better than she could know, though I didn't tell her exactly why. Some things you keep in a drawer. Her eyes kept drifting back to the kettle. I noticed it the way you notice a small thing that keeps happening on a loop. She'd be right in the middle of a sentence, telling me about a client who'd broken down at a summit, or a whiteout she'd guided a whole group through by feel, and her gaze would slide back down to that battered green kettle sitting on the burner, and something would move across her face and then smooth itself right back over before I could read it. At one point, she reached out and ran the pad of her thumb along the dent in its side, the deep one down near the base, the one I've never once bothered to hammer back out because it feels like part of the thing itself now, like a scar you'd miss if it healed. "This kettle's older than it looks," she said, almost to herself. "Somebody kept it a long time." 8 years, I said. "It's just about the last thing I carried out of a night I try hard not to talk about." She went quiet, not the awkward kind of quiet, but the careful kind, like she was holding something fragile in both hands and deciding whether it was safe to set it down. "Then, you carried more than the kettle out," she said, so softly I almost lost it under the rain. I didn't know what to make of that, so I let it drift on past me. I figured she was just being kind, the way decent people are kind when they can tell a subject has teeth in it. I refilled her cup without a word. Outside, the rain began to ease, dropping down from a roar to a steady, even drum on the roof. And inside the tent, the light was gold and low and close, and the whole place smelled like wet canvas and instant coffee, and that particular metal and warm water smell that comes off a kettle that's been going a while. Then she asked me a question that, looking back, should have told me the whole of it. "The Ozable," she said. "That rescue on the Ozable, years back. You were the one who led it, weren't you?" She didn't ask it the way people ask about gossip. She asked it the way a person confirms a thing they already know for certain, and her thumb was resting on the dent again while she said it. "Do you know what really happened out there that night? The whole of it, I mean. Not the version they printed in the paper." I felt the old cold come climbing straight up my spine. Most people don't even know the name of that river, and the handful who do only ever know the printed version, the one with my name pinned to a bad call. I looked at her, this stranger kneeling in my tent asking about the single worst night of my whole life, like she somehow had a stake in it, and I told myself she was just curious. She was a guide. She worked these same mountains for a living. Of course, she'd have heard the old story somewhere. Of course, she'd want to hear it, just once, from the man himself. That's what I told myself. What was actually happening, right there in front of me, was that I had a survivor of that very night kneeling 3 feet away, holding the same kettle I'd once used to keep her alive, and I was so busy guarding my own scar that I couldn't see the living person sitting square in the middle of the memory. She wasn't asking me because she was curious. She was asking me because she already knew the answer cold, and she'd waited 8 long years just to find out whether I did too. It was a long time ago, is all I gave her, and she nodded, and she let me keep it, and we watched the storm wind itself down together in a silence that felt, for the first time in more years than I want to count, like company instead of just the shape of absence. Morning came clear and hard the way it always does after a real mountain storm. The sky scrubbed down to a raw blue, and the sun coming up off the wet ground so bright it actually hurt to look at. The whole field steamed. The contest calls everyone down to the central clearing on the second morning for the check-in and the day's briefing. 150 people or so with mud already climbing the sides of their boots, and I walked down with Grace beside me because after the night we'd spent talking, it felt stranger to walk down without her. I should have felt lighter than I did. Instead, I felt the way I always feel in a crowd of that size, like a man standing in the open waiting for something to fall. And then, I heard a voice cut clean across the clearing that I would have known anywhere on this earth. A voice pitched exactly to Carrie, a voice that had spent an entire career making certain that a room turned itself toward the sound of it. "Well," it said, "look who crawled back up the mountain, Vanessa Rhodes, my ex-wife." 8 years had polished her to a hard shine. She was standing near the sponsor tent in a jacket with her own company's logo stitched across the chest. Because Rhodes Outfitters put its name on this contest now, on the banners and the water stations and the numbered bibs pinned to the front of every single competitor there. She'd built the family business up into something loud and glossy and impossible to miss, and she'd built herself right up alongside it. When she saw me, her mouth did the thing it had always done a half-second before she went for the throat. A small, sharp pull at one corner that a stranger might mistake for the beginning of a smile. She walked over to us slow, letting the people around her take notice first. Then she looked at Grace, took her in from her boots to her hair, one long, unhurried appraisal, and I watched her file the girl away as ammunition before she'd said a single word to her. "I honestly didn't think they let you into things like this anymore," Vanessa said, loud enough now for the nearest 50 people to stop what they were doing in turn. "Not after what happened. You do still remember what happened out there, don't you, Nathan?" I felt the field go quiet in a spreading ring, the exact way water goes still after you drop a stone into it. "Vanessa," I said, "don't." But asking her not to do a thing was like asking the weather to hold. She turned herself, so her back was half to me, and her voice was aimed straight out at the crowd, at the officials in their fleece vests standing near the check-in table, at every single person there who'd never once heard the story and was about to get her version of it. "Some of you are new here, so let me help you out a little," she said, warming to it. "This is Nathan Ellis. 8 years ago, this man led a rescue on the Ausable that ended with somebody dead, Walt Kessler, a guide with 30 years in these mountains. Gone, because this man made a call he had no business ever making. It got ruled an accident. Of course it did. They always get ruled an accident. But every last person who was actually out there that night knows whose judgment put that anchor over that water. She let it sit a beat, let it settle into the mud. So you'll forgive me if I think twice about who I'm choosing to camp next to. The last time this man made a call, a man didn't come home. I have never in my life wanted the ground to just open up and take me the way I wanted it to in that one moment. Every head in the clearing had turned itself toward me, and I could feel it happening in real time, the exact thing I'd spent 8 whole years running from. The way a person's face changes the instant a story about you arrives somewhere before you do. Yesterday I was the quiet guy in the green jacket at the end of the field. Now, in the span of 30 seconds, I was the man who got Walt Kessler killed, and I could see the officials over at the check-in table already leaning their heads together, murmuring low, starting to decide what to do with me. And here is the part of all this that I am the least proud of. My very first instinct, my strongest and oldest instinct, was to just stand there and let her do it, because that is exactly what I'd done for 8 years. When the inquiry cleared my name and the community turned around and convicted me anyway, I didn't fight a word of it. When the paper printed the version with my name set down in the wrong place, I never once picked up the phone to correct it. When Vanessa told all our friends the story with her own self, carefully edited right out of the middle of it, I let her, every time, because the truth had teeth, and I was tired down to the bone, and grief has a way of making silence feel like the only clean thing a man has left to hold. I'd made my private peace with being the villain of that story. I'd built an entire life on the foundation of never once putting my weight down on it. I want to tell you it was courage that kept me quiet. Some noble idea about not speaking ill of the dead or dragging a grieving family back through the worst day of their lives. It wasn't. It was exhaustion, plain and simple, the kind that gets down into your joints and slowly convinces you that fighting for yourself is a form of vanity. Somewhere in those 8 years I had started to believe that I deserved the story, that a man who'd stood in that river and lost should have to carry the blame for it too, like a debt you keep paying long after you've forgotten what you supposedly owed. So I did what I always did. Without even thinking about why, my hand went and found the handle of the kettle I'd carried down to the clearing that morning, and I closed my fingers around the cold metal of it, and I said absolutely nothing. The wind moved the sponsor banners. The sun beat down off the drying mud. 150 people stood there and waited for me to open my mouth and defend myself, and I just held on to that handle and let the sentence stand, the same way I'd let it stand 1,000 quiet times before. Grace was watching me. I felt it, more than I saw it. She was standing right at my shoulder, close enough to touch, and somehow, after one single night, she already knew. She knew exactly what I was about to do, that I was about to fold myself right back down into that old shape and disappear inside it one more time. And she looked at me the way you'd look at somebody you cared about, walking calmly back toward a fire that had already burned them to the ground once. I could feel her deciding something behind those eyes. I just didn't know yet that she'd already decided it 8 years ago, and had driven across a whole state and slept through one flooded tent just to finally see it through. Grace stepped forward before I could get a hand up to stop her. She didn't raise her voice at all. That's the thing I'll remember about it until the day I die. Vanessa had spent her entire life learning exactly how to fill a room to its edges, and Grace did the plain opposite of that. She spoke quietly, evenly, and the whole clearing went so silent, straining to hear her, that the quiet itself did all the work the volume never could have. "I was there," she said. Vanessa turned. "I'm sorry? That night, out on the Ausable, I was there." Grace looked out at the crowd then, not at me, steady as flat water in the early morning. "I was 21 years old and I was on that trip, and when the river came up over its banks, this man pulled me out of it with his own 2 hands. Me and 3 other people. He put the 4 of us under a tarp, and he boiled water on that exact kettle right there, and she nodded once at the thing hanging in my hand, and he kept 4 freezing, half-drowned people alive on that mountain until the sky opened up just enough to move us out. I would not be standing in this clearing this morning if he had made a single different call that night. Not one of us would be. I could not move a muscle, and I happen to know exactly what actually took Walt Kessler," she went on. And now she did turn, slow and deliberate, and she looked straight into Vanessa's face. "Because I was documenting the whole trip, start to finish. I had my camera on me. I have every single photograph from that day, every one of them time-stamped, the crossing and the anchor point and the hardware itself." She reached into the inside of her jacket and drew out a small memory card and held it up between 2 fingers so it caught the hard morning light, a tiny square of plastic that had waited 8 patient years for this precise morning to come around. "The anchor that failed was inspected by your crew, Miss Rhodes. It was Rhodes Outfitters hardware, top to bottom. There is a photograph of the inspection tag with the date printed right on it, and there is a photograph of that same anchor pulling loose over open water. That anchor got signed off in a hurry, and it was never once his decision to trust it. It was never his judgment that killed that man out there. It was your inspection, and it was quietly left out of the report." The clearing didn't erupt. It did something a good deal quieter than that, and a good deal worse for Vanessa. It turned. I watched 150 faces slide right off of me and settle, one by one, onto her instead. I watched the officials over at the table stop their murmuring about me and start murmuring about records, about who exactly had inspected what, about whether anybody in 8 years had ever actually gone back and pulled the old inspection logs on that hardware. The weapon she'd carried all the way up the mountain to use on me had swung itself clean around in her hands, and she knew it in her bones. Her mouth opened, and nothing came back out of it that could hold any weight at all. But I wasn't watching Vanessa anymore. Not really. I was watching Grace. The memory card held up in her fingers, and the dent worn under her thumb the night before, and the way she'd said the kettle, the whole trip, 21 years old, and all at once something in me that had been locked up tight for 8 years came loose in a single motion. The girl. There had been a girl that night who wouldn't let go of the kettle, who held it clamped against her chest under the tarp long after the water inside it had gone stone cold, who I'd had to gently pry it away from at first light, just so I could pack it out. I had carried that girl's face without a name for 8 years, and I had never once, not for a second, connected it to the reason I still carried the kettle itself. 8 years I'd kept that kettle on my burner and told myself it was habit, or superstition, or just a good kettle. And the whole time it had been a promise I'd made without the words for it, to a face I couldn't name, and here that face was, in the clearing with a memory card held up in her hand. I stood up. I hadn't even realized I'd been crouched down over the thing until I wasn't anymore. My hand was unsteady on the handle, and I set the kettle down flat on the table beside me because I no longer entirely trusted myself to keep hold of it. "It was you," I said. My voice came out low and rough at the edges. "You were the girl, the one who wouldn't let go of the kettle." "I was," she said simply, "and for the first time in 8 long years, I made a different choice than the one I'd always made." I turned to the officials, and to the crowd, and to the woman I used to be married to, and I stopped protecting the story that had gone and protected everyone in it except me. "She's telling you the truth," I said, loud enough this time. "Every last word of it. Pull the logs." I should have stood up and said this 8 years ago, And I didn't, and a good man's family had to live all that time with the wrong story because I was too tired and too far gone to make anyone sit down and read the right one. That part is on me, and I'll carry it. But it ends this morning. I looked over at Grace. It ends right here, right now. I didn't stay to watch what happened to Vanessa. I've heard since that the officials pulled the old inspection records, that the story got corrected in the places it had been wrong for 8 years, and that Walt Kessler's name got moved back to the side of the ledger where it belonged. His family deserved that long before they got it. But that morning I didn't care about clearing my own name half as much as I cared about the woman in front of me, the one who'd carried the proof of my innocence across a whole state just to hand it back. We walked out of the clearing together, away from all the noise of it, back up the slope toward the tree line where I'd pitched my tent, and for a good long while neither one of us said anything at all. "You planned this," I finally said. "It wasn't an accusation, not even close. I just needed to hear the shape of it said out loud between us." She almost smiled. "Not the storm. Even I couldn't plan the storm." Then she told me the rest. She'd seen my name on the competitor roster the day registration opened, and something 8 years old had stood straight up inside her chest. She'd requested the plot next to mine off the site map. She'd driven up 2 days early. She'd come all this way to find me, she said, because she'd spent the better part of a decade knowing exactly what kind of man had knelt in the dark and kept her breathing, and she couldn't stand that he was still walking around believing he was the villain of that night. The flooded tent was real. Staking it low near the drainage had not, entirely, been an accident. "I used a true thing to get myself to a truer one," she said, "and I'm not the least bit sorry about it." I wasn't either. Not for a second. I'd like to tell you everything, just knit itself neatly back together fast after that the truth got out, and I simply turned back into the man I'd been before the river ever took anything from me. That is not how it went, and I'm glad now that it isn't, because the fast, easy version would have been a lie. Grace didn't fix me. Nobody fixes anybody. What she did instead was something harder and quieter than fixing. She stayed. She started coming up to Lake Placid on her days off, then on days that weren't off at all. She'd sit in the corner with her boots on the workbench and talk to me while I restitched some family's dying tent, and the tapping of the cables on the drying rack stopped being the sound of a man alone and started being the sound of a room with 2 people in it. She stole the one good chair. She argued with me about waterproofing like it was life and death. She hung a photograph over the bench one afternoon, one of her own, a mountain I didn't recognize with the light coming across it like something being forgiven. It was slow, and it was slow on purpose. Neither one of us was in any hurry to get anywhere in particular, because we'd both learned the hard way exactly what happens to people who rush out across water they haven't stopped to check first. There were whole evenings where we just sat there together and didn't say much of anything. There was a first time I reached over and set my hand on the back of her neck, and she leaned back into it instead of pulling away, and that was the single biggest thing that happened for a solid month, and somehow it was more than enough. About 10 months on from that contest, I did something I hadn't so much as considered doing in 8 years. I took a call. It came from a regional outfit that trains new guides and volunteer responders, the young people who go up the mountain so other people can make it back down. They'd heard, through the small world these mountains are, the corrected version of the Ausable. They asked if a man who'd once led rescues in these peaks would come teach the new ones how you keep 4 freezing people alive under a tarp until the sky opens. I very nearly said no. That old reflex runs deep. The silence had kept me safe and small a long time, and safe is a hard thing to hand back. Grace was there in the shop when the call came in. She didn't push me toward anything. She just walked over and took the green kettle down off the shelf where it lives now, filled it up at the tap, and set it down on the little burner in the corner, and she looked at me while it started to tick and warm and complain, and she never said a single word, and I understood exactly what she was telling me without any of them. That the thing sitting there in my hands had kept people alive once, and it could go and do it again, but only if I finally stopped hiding it away in a room above a shop. I said yes. I won't pretend the first class went off without a hitch. I stood in front of a dozen kids in borrowed rain shells with my throat closed up tight, and there was a long moment where I nearly walked straight out the door, where letting myself be truly seen felt like more than I had left in me. Grace was in the back. She didn't rush to save me. She just set the kettle down on the table at the front where I could see it. The dent turned to face me and waited, and I put my hand flat on the warm side of it, and I went on. That's how most of the hard days went. Not fixed, not erased, just carried, by two people instead of one. A full year on from that stormy night, the kettle still whistles every morning in a workshop that isn't quiet anymore. We run the gear shop together now, and the training program out of the back of it, and the same faces still walk past the window and nod, except now they nod at both of us. She hangs her photographs up where the empty walls used to be. I teach on Saturday mornings. The dent in the side of the kettle is right exactly where it's always been, and in a whole year, neither one of us has ever once suggested hammering it back out. You spent 8 years carrying that night all by yourself, she told me one morning, watching the steam climb up off the burner in the gray light. Let me carry the mornings, so she does. And I let her. And it turns out that's most of what love really is, seen up close and from the inside, not the rescue itself. The long string of ordinary mornings that come after it. I've thought a whole lot about that first night since then, the stranger kneeling there in my tent with her hand held out toward me in the dark. The thing is, she was never once a stranger to me. She'd been carrying a piece of me around for 8 years, the true version of the worst night of my entire life, keeping it safe the whole time the way she'd once kept that kettle safe against her chest under the tarp, just waiting for the one day she could finally hand it back and stand there and watch me let myself believe it. I used to think that I saved her life out on the Ausable. And I did. That part is true, and I'll always be grateful I was there too. But I've slowly come to understand that it ran the other way just exactly as much. Because for 8 years, I was the one quietly going under, drowning a little more with every season that passed, telling myself the wrong story about my own life until I very nearly disappeared clean into it. And she was the one who came looking, and found me, and pulled me back up into the air. Sometimes the person who saves you turns out to be the very same one you once saved. I thought I'd pulled her out of that river. Turns out she'd been carrying me out of it ever since. So let me leave you with 2 things I still turn over in my head. If you'd stayed silent for 8 long years to protect the truth, even when that silence cost you just about everything you had, would you have finally found the nerve to speak? And have you ever once been saved by someone you were absolutely certain you were the one saving? If this story stayed with you, do me a favor before you go. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me down in the comments. Would you have let her stay that night?